Okay, doctorarjaybe, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Alzheimer's disease. You know, the problem with Alzheimer's has been, maybe a little bit more common these days because of the fact that we're diagnosing it earlier and earlier. One of the difficulties with Alzheimer's in the past was that we had no way to tell what was going on in the brain until after the person passed away. So in those cases, now you can say, okay, that's what was going on with the dementia. The brain looks unhealthy. Oh, okay, now I understand. But that's a little bit not helpful. You want to be able to tell what's going on, and you want to be able to tell it early enough so if there is a treatment available, you want to be able to use that early enough so to spare the person from having, dementia issues. With Alzheimer dementia, frequently the person has a lot of problems with the memory, may start doing things that they normally would not do, because of difficulty with the thought processes. The person may do something unusual, like try to go outside wearing only the bathrobe, or go for a walk and get lost because they don't know where they're at. So things like this can be a difficulty for the family. And Alzheimer can get to the point where a person starts losing function all over the body. So they may lose the ability to walk. They may lose the ability to eat by themselves or dress themselves. So it becomes a problem where there's a lot of care that's needed in those cases. These days, they've studied Alzheimer at the microscopic level, and they've determined that there's some abnormal proteins that build up in the brain of somebody with Alzheimer's. The number one protein that builds up is called amyloid. And amyloid is a protein that's formed because of waste products from other proteins. It's kind of a protein that's all twisted and folded, and so it's kind of clumped. And this abnormal protein causes problems because it can damage the cells. And eventually there'll be so many brain cells damaged that the brain actually is shrinks to a smaller state, and a person doesn't have the ability to function properly. Now, normally the brain has a kind of a vacuum that cleans up the abnormal proteins and waste products called the microglia. Most nerves have cells on the outside that help them to function and take care of any waste products, etc. In the brain, these are called microglia, and these cells basically help to remove waste products from the brain. If there's any damage to a cell in the brain, those waste products from the bad cell will be basically eaten by these microglia cells, and that prevents any of these abnormal proteins from building up. As we get older, these microglia cells become less efficient at removing the waste products. And that's when these waste products and abnormal proteins can build up and then can cause the injury to the brain. A similar type buildup of protein is in the patient who has Parkinson's syndrome. It's actually a different form of the same protein that causes Alzheimer's. The Alzheimer protein is called amyloid beta, and the Parkinson's form is the alpha form of it. So these are two very similar proteins. One that causes the dementia of Alzheimer's, and the other that causes the damage in the brain from Parkinson's syndrome. The Parkinson's syndrome, when it goes into a late stage, actually does cause another type of dementia that's associated with the Parkinson's, which is could be differentiated from Alzheimer's by the type of dementia that's formed. But for most people, the one that most people are concerned about is this Alzheimer's syndrome, because it's relatively common in older people, and so that's their biggest concern. Now, these days they do have some medications that are available. I mentioned that this abnormal protein called amyloid, which builds up in the brain, causes the dementia. So 2 companies have come out with a monoclonal antibody, which helps to absorb this protein and remove it from the brain. And they're doing some research studies. They seem to be able to slow down the progression of Alzheimer's. However, once you already have the amyloid built up, you may be able to prevent more amyloid from forming, but you have difficulty removing all the amyloid that's already there. So the hope is that we can determine by some tests who's going to develop Alzheimer later by some test result. Now we have a test that's on the market from Quest Diagnostics, which seems to be this answer. By checking blood levels of certain proteins, they can determine if somebody has a risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Also, there's a type of brain scan called a PET scan, PET, positive emission test, and these tests can determine if there's an abnormality in the brain, which can give some prognosis to whether the person is going to develop Alzheimer's in the future also. So it looks like that maybe in the near future, some of these tests will be able to give people an idea of whether they have a risk of Alzheimer's, and they can either make their precautions, let's say have discussions with their family about what might happen in the future, or they might be able to get on a treatment early enough that it may prevent the disease from happening in the first place. Okay, hope this is helpful.